Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy that we're hosting today for the third time Professor Jonathan Gershoni, who was our first speaker. If some of you remember, he was our first speaker ever on our Monday calls with Elnet. I'm sorry, we have some noise in the background. Professor Gershoni received his PhD in biochemistry at the Hebrew University and then postdoc training at the Yale School of Medicine. And for 30 years, he has investigated the immune response towards viruses such HIV, HCV, and SARS-CoV. He continues to develop novel methods for the computational characterization of the antibody composition in blood and applications towards new immunodiagnostics and preventive vaccines. That was a mouthful, I'm sorry. Professor Gershoni has worked as a visiting scientist at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda and at Boston University. He has repeatedly been awarded Teacher of the Year at Tel Aviv University and has served as the director of the Israeli AIDS Task Force. And we're very, very happy, Professor Gershoni, that you're here with us tonight. I would like to start, from asking you the question that probably everyone wants to hear the answer to. Can you please give us some overview of the status of the COVID-19 right now, the Omicron variant in Israel and in the US and Europe, and what we can anticipate in the coming weeks?
Yes. No, that's fine. Okay, so first of all, it is a pleasure to be with you all. It's very bizarre because, as you mentioned, I had the privilege of addressing Elnet very early on, about 2 years ago. And at the time, like many of us, professionals and lay people, we actually thought that we knew what we were talking about, where we're heading, how a pandemic is going to evolve. And we all believed that once we have a vaccine, we should be pretty much okay. And over this last 2 years, we've realized that everything, and I mean everything, has been unanticipated. We've been on a roller coaster of a reality show. We're learning as we're walking, we're running as we're learning. And we have all been traumatized by a serious global pandemic that has affected all of us, not only health-wise, but politics and the economy and education. And look, we're all here now talking on Zoom as if it's second nature. So this is quite remarkable. Now, the latest development, and we've all talked about it, is a variant of concern called Omicron. In view of the fact that I realized that you wanted some substance and not just general comments, I allowed myself this time to prepare a few slides. If it becomes overbearing, just Marta, raise your hand and I'll see, and we'll go to other questions. But I think that this might give you a good overview as to where this all comes from, where we're heading, and what we're in store for or not. So let me share my screen with you. And can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, fine. And I'm just going to shift. Okay. So this is the 2-year Corona update. This is the first of many updates to come. Hopefully in 10 years, we'll be able to talk about Corona in other terms. But right now, we're in the midst of a pandemic. I do believe that it's going to die down and we'll come to some sort of harmony and ability to live with Corona. but all of our anticipations 2 years ago that it's going to peter out obviously are wrong. I've titled this From Alpha to Omicron, Variants of Concern. And when we talk about variants of concern, you have to know that the CDC has identified a number of different levels of how concerned we should be with various genetic variations of the viruses that are infecting us. And the first and the lowest level is we find that there's a mutation, and we call it a variant of interest because it doesn't seem of concern. The next level is that we seem to have mutations that affect the efficiency of infection, that they become all the more infectious. They may have some impact on the development of disease. They may be difficult for us to diagnose and so forth. But so long as we believe that the vaccines that we've developed do provide some protection, they're still left within the realm of variant of concern. The next level, which none of the variants of corona have been tagged with, would be a variant of high consequence, meaning it's a variant that's changed so much that it's difficult for us to diagnose and it's difficult for us to protect against with the vaccine. This has not occurred, and I do not believe we're going to get to that level. So that's encouraging. Now, if we look here, we can see what do the variants that we've seen so far, how do they rank as far as their efficiency in infection? And as you can see, Omicron here is the most infectious. It's very, very infectious. And I'm just going to do that. I had to change something on the screen. But we see that we have Omicron BA2, which we've learned just recently, is even about 30% more infectious than BA1. And we thought that BA1 is far more infectious than Delta, and they're all more infectious than the original ancestral strain of Wuhan. So we've seen alpha, beta, there are a whole bunch of Greek letters. I only put out alpha, beta, delta, Omicron, BA, and B2. Now that deals with the infection efficiency. But if we ask, what about the severity of the disease of the unvaccinated? Here we see that Delta is the most pathogenic. It causes the most severe disease. And Delta is worse than Omicron BA1 or BA2, and certainly worse than Beta Alpha and Wuhan. What about protection by vaccination? Now here we've changed our whole concept of what vaccines do. Because when we started early on 2 years ago, we believed that if we have a vaccine, it'll be a vaccine like measles vaccine. You get one shot, you may get a boost, but you're protected for life. In reality, what we've realized is coronaviruses are very different. And it appears that even the vaccinated, whereas the vaccine provides very, very good protection against the deterioration and development of severe disease, it does not provide the protection from infection per se. And so if we see that, we've all been vaccinated, or many of us have been vaccinated, and if we haven't all been, we should be all vaccinated fully and boosted. It does protect against the development of severe disease, hospitalization, and the requirement for respiration, and God forbid death. But these vaccine protocols that we've been using thus far don't seem to protect us against infection per se. Now, I put together a few slides to show you how the different waves have occurred in different countries. So we normally have seen the rise and fall of a given variant, which defines a wave. And if we look at the United Kingdom, I indicated here is the same December 2020, and you'll see that in each one. So you'll also see how the countries have changed and who started first or not. Now, the United Kingdom had a very strong wave even before December of the Alpha variant. And in fact, the Alpha variant, which we'll talk about in a second, indeed started in the United Kingdom. And then it was followed by Delta. And what we see here is the emergence of Omicron, which seems to displace Delta. And here in the corner, we see the Omicron, that's the BA2. This is the BA1. And so this is a general picture, and I'll shift to a few more. Here, if we look at Italy, you recall that Italy was hit very hard with Alpha, Delta, and then again, we see the overtaking of Omicron. So Omicron seems to be taking over the different countries. If we look here at South France, we have here the appearance of Beta, and Beta actually originated in South Africa very early on. Again, Delta, Omicron, and we see that Omicron's taken over Delta in South Africa, and the BA2 is there as well. Denmark was interesting because Denmark, everybody felt that Omicron is basically well taken care of Denmark, but then we realized that BA2 has taken a very large proportion of that wave. And if we look at the US was pretty late in coming in with the Alpha, the Delta, and Omicron, and a little bit of the BA2. India, a huge amount of BA2. And in Israel, we have an interesting profile in the sense that we had an early on Alpha and a dramatic drop. This is where the country shut down. And so we realized that shutting down it had a dramatic effect, but it didn't have a long-term effect. And once we started to open up the economy again and so on, thinking that, we can go out, and I won't quote anybody specifically, but someone said we can all go out and cheer and drink beer. Well, the virus didn't like that. And as you can see, it bounced back, and we've been dealing with it ever since. Now, what are these differences in mutations? I'm not going to get into the molecular biology, but this is the business end of the spike protein of the Wuhan. This is a backbone picture of the atomic structure of that which is the target for neutralization. And early on in Alpha, the only difference, as you can see, is just this one amino acid residue, which you don't care about, but I color-coded it. You can see there's only one point that differs between Alpha and Wuhan in this area of the protein. I want to stress that. There are other changes, but this is the only important one that I believe was the case. Now, if we look at Beta, 2 new mutations occurred, but basically you can see it's generally the same. And Delta skipped these 2 blue ones and the red one and have 2 more green ones. That's about it. So we see that the changes between Alpha, Beta, and Delta seem minor. And then all of a sudden, we're confronted with Omicron. So look at the difference. Omicron is really overwhelmed with 11 mutations here, plus 3 more, which is the BA1 mutation of Omicron. So we have a dramatic accumulation of mutations in the transition from Wuhan to Omicron, as opposed to Wuhan to Delta. And if we look at BA2, the 3 violet mutations are exchanged for 2 purple ones here. So this is the only difference. So for the most part, BA1 and BA2, looking at this area of the molecule, is very much the same, but overwhelming in the sense that it has a lot of mutations. So the question then becomes, where did it come from? Why do we all of a sudden have this huge shift? And there are a number of ideas, one of which I think is very interesting and telling. And the idea is that Omicron emerged from South Africa. We have a lot of prevalence of HIV in South Africa. And there are a lot of people who are double infected, HIV and COVID-19. And in an immunocompromised person, the virus is constantly experiencing a bit of the immune system, but not enough to clear. And as you know, in HIV, it's acquired immunodeficiency. So one of the hypotheses, this has not been proven, is that Omicron evolved in an immunocompromised patient and was a percolating long-term infection for months. And therefore, the virus in this environment of immunocompromised system can mutate, test, change, vary, and accumulate a lot of mutations and gradually become highly infectious. The second hypothesis is that maybe, as you recall, about a year ago, there was infection of COVID-19 of minks. We saw that in Denmark, we saw that in Holland. And so some people have proposed maybe sometime some other animal was infected with COVID-19. The virus changed in that animal and then went back to the human population. This has been proposed. I don't believe that's the case, but I want to be fair. The one that is most concerning to me is that MSD, Merck Shark and Dohme, developed a therapeutic for Omicron, and you're aware of the fact that this has been offered as a possible therapeutic. It is a nucleoside analog. That means it interferes with the replication of the RNA of the virus. And apparently, again, this is a hypothesis, it hasn't been proven, that in the course of the clinical trials, when we do clinical trials, we do escalating doses. We start with low dose and gradually increase to see the tolerance, the toxicity. And one of the ideas that has been proposed is that in the lower doses of this drug, that don't ask me to pronounce it, it's right in front of you, at the lower dose, the suboptimal doses, this afforded the opportunity for the virus to begin to mutate, but the dose was not high enough to knock out the virus. And at this intermediate level, a low suboptimal dose of the drug, it was what caused the situation that the virus could accumulate a lot of mutations. We don't know that for a fact, but there's been a hold put on the usage of the molnupiravir of MSD. So these are three ideas as to why do we all of a sudden see this dramatic effect. Now, the last thing I want to say, and then we'll stop with the slides, deals with vaccination. And the vaccination, what I've done is I've put just 2 or 3 slides showing you the profile. What we see here is I've indicated at what date we reached 50% fully vaccinated in Israel. And we did that very early on. And then you can see that we implemented a booster program also pretty early, and we've reached a total of 66% of fully vaccinated, not necessarily fully boosted. So this was the picture that we had, and Israel took a lot of pride in the fact that we came in early. We started vaccinating early, and we started the boost first and early. However, we have to remember Israel's a very small country. And so our 50% is about 5 million fully vaccinated. If we look at the situation in the United States has only reached 64%, but that 64% is very impressive as far as I'm concerned. We're talking about a population of 250 million and more, 300 and some million. And so what you can see is that the date of 50% was markedly after Israel, and the United States is in the midst of trying to increase people with boosting. France is very high with 76, and the 50% was reached in August, and 50% in July, and 78% fully vaccinated in Italy. And I'm going to unshare now and just mention the fact that we are confronted today with a major, major problem. The major problem is this. We know that vaccination is beneficial. We know that it prevents hospitalization and severe disease. It does not seem to be effective in preventing infection and multiple infections. We have seen people convalescent, people who have been ill, which in our mind should be immune, but they are not, and they too can get infected. We've seen vaccinated convalescents. What we talked today about hybrid protection, convalescence and vaccine. And that too is not sufficient to prevent infection the way we're doing it now. We need to encourage people to vaccinate. And we are confronted because people are disillusioned and they feel that the vaccine isn't working because people are getting infected, then people are reluctant to actually get vaccinated. This is wrong. The vaccine is working very well in order to reduce severe disease. It is not working sufficiently well to prevent infection. Parenthetically, and I think in the invitation to this talk, I indicated or I requested that you post my TED Talk. In the TED Talk, I try to explain what is the nature of the new vaccines and how it works and why is this important. So I urge you, if you can and if you're interested, then we won't waste the time now to repeat what I said in the talk, because we've already discussed that. And if it's clear and useful, please feel free to share it. But I think that it's really important today to try to encourage people to vaccinate. And I think that that more or less covers my intro slide. And Marta, it's up to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I highly recommend the TED Talk. If you haven't seen it, it's actually very interesting how you can make a story about, vaccinations and make it actually fascinating. So I really highly recommend it.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the vaccinations that we have right now, they are protecting us from probably death and from severe COVID. But should we be, or are the scientists on the lookout for new types of vaccines or drugs that can actually might give us some more protection?
So that's a good point. First of all, I want to stress the fact that the general perception of viruses, people who are not hardcore vaccinologists and virologists sort of lump all of the viruses together. And this is wrong. Each virus may be a member of a different family. So we know that there's measles, there's flu, there's polio, there's HIV/AIDS, hepatitis C, and corona. We have never tried to deal with pandemic corona by vaccination. This is the first time. And so whereas we had hoped that vaccinating against corona would afford lifelong immunity like we've experienced with polio and with measles, mumps, rubella, it turns out that coronaviruses are not really amenable, from what I see so far, to this type of robust sterilizing lifelong immunity. And it could be that the writing was on the wall. I told you in the past that there are 7 types of coronaviruses that infect people. 4 of them cause the common cold. 30% of when you have sniffles and you're sneezing and you have a cold, it's a coronavirus. There are 4 strains. But those who have studied coronaviruses, these cold-causing coronaviruses, all recognize the fact that you develop a cold, you clear the virus, the immunity wanes, and you get reinfected even within the same year. So this seems to be a natural characteristic of corona. And it could be that we are confronted with a virus that behaves differently. It isn't measles. Now, of course, I'm very interested as a vaccinologist and as a virologist to try to understand what is the difference. But we've been confronted, and especially people like myself who've been working on HIV/AIDS. We've been doing this now since '81, so it's almost 40 years, or it is 40 years, and we've completely and totally failed. And and theoretically, you could say that HIV is a virus. We know how to make a polio vaccine, a measles vaccine. We're not idiots. And there are thousands and thousands of people spending billions and billions of dollars trying to do this. And for the last 40 years, we do not have an AIDS vaccine. We don't have a hepatitis C vaccine. So each virus has to be understood differently. Now, with the question, are we in store with new vaccine modalities? My guess would be that we are going to see at some point a live attenuated vaccine like Sabin's oral polio vaccine or like the measles vaccine. These are vaccines that are virus, they infect, but they've been attenuated. They don't cause disease. And I would hope to see a live attenuated vaccine and delivered to the nasal cavity and oral cavity by a spray. This would afford protection of our air passages and therefore possibly also have a much better efficacy in preventing infection. So this is what we were looking for. However, in the grand scheme of things, so long as we have the vaccines that we already have, and they are reducing severe disease, this is what allows us to maintain a functional healthcare system. We do not want to overwhelm the system. We need to get vaccinated.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would like to ask you, have we reached some kind of degree of herd immunity that is necessary, and will it be again, working against the new variants? Recently, Europe was, very surprised with the decision of Denmark that apparently they decided to lift all the COVID restrictions, including wearing masks anywhere. You don't need any vaccination proof. But on the other hand, the statistics that at least I was, I could see we're saying that 80% of Danish population has been vaccinated twice and 60% of them got the booster.
So the reality is this, and we're constantly changing the questions and the answers and certainly the perceptions. Initially, we believed, and the concept of herd immunity is that you get vaccinated. Vaccination is going to be very efficient in preventing infection and recurrent infection. And we also said that if somebody who is naturally infected, he's experienced COVID-19, he will also be naturally immune. And so as we accumulate more and more people who are protected, there are fewer and fewer people that the virus can infect, so we reach a level of herd immunity. The problem is twofold. The first is that with convalescence vaccination and vaccination of convalescents, we still are getting infected, which is unique to corona. And so the concept that if we get vaccinated, we're no longer going to get infected anymore doesn't seem to be the case. The second is that we're seeing very aggressive, highly efficient viruses like Omicron, BA1 and BA2. So in Denmark, exactly what we said is that despite the fact that so many people are efficiently vaccinated and possibly boosted, nonetheless, we see infection and breakthrough infection of the vaccinees and the recoveries. And so we're not experiencing the comfort of bona fide herd immunity. Nobody's getting sick. That being said, we also realize that Omicron seems to be less pathogenic, causing disease, and those who are vaccinated tend to experience a milder bout with COVID-19, and so it can be tolerated. And so if you talk about the policies of the governments in trying to manage, on the one hand, education, economy, the public's psyche, the psychological impact, and of course, health proper, this is a balance that we don't know exactly how to best manage it. And we know that after 2 years of frustration, everybody is basically totally pissed off. And that being the case, people are in a situation that is saying, fine, you know, if I'm going to experience a mild COVID, believe me, that's better than having to wear my mask cooped up and isolated. So we're learning this. This is a difficult situation. And one thing, if you think in terms of historical perspective, our situation is probably orders of magnitude better than what our ancestors in World War I, 1918, experienced with the Spanish flu. 50 million people died of Spanish flu. We are approaching 6 million people from COVID-19 after 2 years. So we have a tendency to be totally depressed and certainly traumatized by experiencing a modern global pandemic. But for the most part, if Denmark and other countries and Israel and so on are starting to some degree relax and going in different directions and testing what could be the right policies, it's because we can afford to do so. We've got good health plans. We do have the vaccination in place, and we're learning how to cope.
Thank you. You mentioned, you know, the government's policies. Let's talk shortly about the Israeli government's policies, which have changed on really weekly basis during the current wave and the previous waves as well. And there have been a lot of people who are criticizing those constant changes. Would you describe it as a, you know, display of a total chaos, or did the actual changing restrictions reflect a government that knows how to be flexible and adaptable? How would you describe it?
Well, first of all, just the upfront statement, I don't deal with policy. So my opinion is no different than any one of yours, but I'll share my opinion. I think the general public tends to be loud, frustrated, not typically analytical, not forthgiving or generous, critical. And with Israelis, we can amplify all of that maybe 10 times compared to the more reserved countries in Europe and the United States. All of you who've been to Israel know that we are an interesting people. And so that being the case, we tend to voice our opinions loudly. Now, I personally believe that, first of all, you cannot negotiate with a virus. So you have a lot of people who are complaining and argue, I'm not going to stand in line. I'm not going to do that. I'm not, but we're not in a position to negotiate. The virus simply doesn't give a damn. So that being the case, we have to realize that we're trying to find effective policies in order to cope with a natural horrific event. It would be like standing in front of one of the volcanoes that is erupting and saying, I'm going to go on with life, I'm going to use an umbrella. So it's sort of silly. So the virus is doing what it does. Have we been totally chaotic? It seems so, but I don't think so. I think that the teams of experts are sincere. They're highly professional. I take enormous pride in the fact that when the FDA evaluated the vaccine protocols, 2 Israeli scientists were asked to share the Israeli scientific analytical perspectives. Sharon Elroy-Price and Professor Ron Milo from Weizmann Institute. I have enormous respect for sport events, but I think those 2 scientists should have received gold medals on their performance. They were detailed, they were highly effective, and I took enormous pride. I watched the deliberations of the FDA, and they constantly said that the Israeli analysis was compelling, person after person after person. And this is a huge, huge accomplishment in our critical analysis of the situation and affording recommendations on how to behave. However, the virus doesn't care. And so we are confronted with issues as how do we get our kids back into class? How do we deal with the economy? We saw that we were very early on to shut down the whole economy. There was an immediate drop because nobody left their home, but this isn't a solution. And we're only listening now today that Australia is going to open up their borders. So, there have been countries that have been very severe and everybody's being affected. So we're trying to find out, have we made errors? I'm sure. Could we have done it better? I'm not sure, because we have to take into account not only the pure scientific aspects of the virus, vaccines, immunity, healthcare, but we also need to take into a consideration the economy and the political climate. We've had, I don't have to tell you, we've had a few elections here and there. So this is a difficult situation. It's not sufficient to say I'm just doing my best, okay, but I do think we're doing a reasonably good job. And unfortunately, it's not being complemented with reasonably good results.